Son, I don't care whose name is on that deed. You don't walk into this office like you own the place. He said it loud enough for the whole floor to hear. Loud enough that the two junior associates near the window looked up from their laptops. Loud enough that the receptionist pretended to be very, very busy with something on her desk that clearly did not need her attention right then. The man who said it was Randolph Cutter, 61 years old, senior managing partner at Cutter, Holt & Briggs, one of the oldest commercial real estate firms in Memphis, Tennessee. He had a corner office with a view of the river. He had a photograph on his wall, shaking hands with a former governor. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel like they needed to explain themselves just for being in the room. The man he said it to was Lawrence Osei, 44 years old. He was wearing a gray herringbone blazer that was not expensive looking. His shoes were clean, but not flashy. He carried a slim leather portfolio under his arm, the kind you buy at a mid-range office supply store. He had driven himself here in a 10-year-old Nissan Altima and parked it 2 blocks away because the lot out front charged $8 and he didn't see the point. Lawrence did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He looked at Randolph Cutter with the kind of calm that takes years to build. The kind that comes from being underestimated so many times that you stop being surprised by it and start using it instead. He said, "I appreciate that. Is the conference room available?" And that right there, that single question, that was the moment. Nobody in that office knew it yet. But that was the moment everything started moving in one direction, and Randolph Cutter started moving toward the edge of a cliff he couldn't see. Let's back up, because you need to understand how a man like Randolph Cutter gets to be the way he is. He didn't build Cutter, Holt & Briggs from nothing, his father did. Gerald Cutter started the firm in 1971 with 2 other men, one of whom, Harold Holt, sold his share back to the family in 1989. The name Briggs refers to a man who died in 1983 and whose family hasn't been involved since the Reagan administration. So, what you really have is Cutter and Cutter, handed down from father to son, with a letterhead that sounds more impressive than it is. Randolph joined the firm at 26, made partner at 33, took over fully when his father had his first stroke at 68. He's been running it for 11 years, and in those 11 years the firm has done fine. Not exceptional. Fine. They manage commercial leases for mid-sized businesses, handle property acquisitions for a handful of regional developers, and represent a few old money families in Memphis who've been clients since Gerald's day. Randolph is comfortable. That's the word for it. He's comfortable in the way that men who inherit something are comfortable. Not because they've earned ease, but because they've never had to fight for it, and so they've mistaken their starting line for a finish line. He has opinions about who belongs in his office, about who looks like a serious businessman and who doesn't, about who deserves his attention and who is wasting his time. He has never said any of this out loud, exactly. He doesn't have to. The way he looks at certain people says it for him. Lawrence Osei had been in Randolph's orbit for exactly 40 minutes before that comment in the lobby. And in those 40 minutes, Randolph had already decided everything he thought he needed to know. The story starts 8 months earlier, at an estate auction in Shelby County. A property called the Montrose Building, 5 stories, built in 1938, sitting on the corner of a street in downtown Memphis that had been slowly, quietly becoming valuable again. The kind of building that people who pay attention know about 6 years before everyone else does. Original brick facade, high ceilings, an atrium on the 2nd floor, with skylights that hadn't been cleaned in 2 decades, but were structurally sound. The previous owner had used the ground floor as a furniture warehouse and left the upper 4 floors essentially empty. It sold at auction for $2.1 million. The winning bidder was a holding company called Lakeview Meridian, LLC. Nobody at the auction paid much attention to who was behind Lakeview Meridian. The firm that submitted the paperwork was a small outfit out of Nashville. The principals were listed in the filings, but nobody looked that closely. Lawrence Osei looked that closely. At everything. That was how he worked. He had spent the previous 12 years building a portfolio of commercial properties across Tennessee, Georgia, and Mississippi. He started with a duplex in South Haven, that he bought at 29 with money he'd saved working construction management for 6 years after college. He flipped it, bought 2 more, held them, borrowed against them, and kept moving. By the time he was 38, he had his first commercial property. By 42, he had 11. Not all of them glamorous. Some of them were strip mall units in mid-sized towns. Some of them were industrial spaces leased to storage companies. But they were his, free and clear, and they generated income every single month. He bought the Montrose building because he knew what that block was going to be worth in 4 years. He bought it the way you buy something. When you've done your homework and you trust the numbers, and you don't need anyone else's permission or validation. Then he contacted Cutter, Holt & Briggs about property management. He'd heard they had relationships with several commercial tenants he was interested in approaching. He wasn't looking to hand over full management. Just a referral arrangement. A few introductions. He was willing to pay a reasonable finder's fee and structure something that would benefit both sides. He sent an email through the firm's website. Nobody responded for 11 days. He followed up with a phone call. The woman who answered told him someone would be in touch. 3 days later, a junior associate named, and this matters, Thomas Alcott called him back. Thomas Alcott was 28 years old and had been with the firm for 14 months. He was pleasant enough on the phone. He said he'd look into it and get back to Lawrence within the week. He did not get back to Lawrence within the week. Lawrence called again. Thomas Alcott said he was still working on getting the right people looped in. Lawrence asked who the right people were. Thomas said he'd have to check with the partners. 3 more weeks passed. At this point, Lawrence had spent a combined 4 hours on the phone and via email, trying to give this firm a business opportunity. He had other options. He had a property attorney in Nashville he liked. He had contacts in Atlanta. He didn't need Cutter, Holt & Briggs specifically. But Lawrence Osei had a particular kind of patience. The patience of a man who has learned to let other people reveal themselves before he shows his hand. So he decided to show up in person. He drove to Memphis on a Tuesday morning. He parked 2 blocks away. He walked into the lobby of Cutter, Holt & Briggs at 10:14 a.m. The receptionist asked if he had an appointment. He said he didn't, but that he'd been in contact with the firm for over a month, and he'd like to speak with whoever handled new commercial property accounts. She picked up the phone, made a call, put it down, said someone would be with him shortly. He waited 22 minutes. Then Randolph Cutter came through the glass door at the back of the reception area and sized him up in about 4 seconds. "Can I help you?" he said. Not warmly. Lawrence introduced himself. Said he owned the Montrose building. Said he'd been trying to connect with the firm about a possible referral arrangement. Randolph Cutter looked at him. The way some men look at a car in a parking lot that they think might be taking up too much space. He said, "That property's under new ownership. Some holding company out of Nashville." Lawrence said, "That's me. That's my holding company." There was a pause. Then Randolph said slowly, like he was doing Lawrence a favor by entertaining this, "And you have documentation of that." Lawrence opened his portfolio, pulled out a single page, set it on the reception desk. Randolph glanced at it. Didn't pick it up. He said, "Son, I don't care whose name is on that deed. You don't walk into this office like you own the place." The junior associates looked up. The receptionist found something very interesting to look at. Lawrence said, "Is the conference room available? If you had been in that lobby and you were watching this happen, what would you have done? Would you have said something? Would you have looked away? Would you have told yourself it wasn't your business? That's a question worth sitting with. Keep it in mind." Randolph did not take Lawrence to the conference room. He told the receptionist to have Thomas Alcott come out front, and then he went back through the glass door without another word. Thomas Alcott came out 7 minutes later. He was apologetic in that particular way. Young professionals are apologetic when they're embarrassed by someone above them, but can't say so. He shook Lawrence's hand. He took him to a small side room near the copy machines that was definitely not the conference room, but had a table and 2 chairs. They talked for 35 minutes. Thomas was actually a decent enough young man. He listened, he took notes. He said the right things about the Montrose location and the potential for foot traffic once the block development picked up. He said he'd bring it to the partners and follow up by Friday. Lawrence drove back to Nashville. Friday came, no call. Lawrence called Thomas, voicemail. He left a message, waited until Tuesday, called again. Thomas picked up, apologized, said there had been some internal back and forth about whether this was the right fit for the firm's current capacity. Lawrence asked what that meant. Thomas said he'd need to get back to him. Lawrence thanked him, hung up, and opened a different app on his phone. He made 2 calls. One to a woman named Cheryl Beaumont Cross, who ran commercial real estate PR in Memphis and knew everyone and everything about the market. One to a man named Paul Ifini, his attorney in Nashville. He told both of them the same thing. He said, "I'm going to need you to make a few phone calls on my behalf. Nothing urgent. Just, let's make sure the right people know the Montrose building has an owner, and that owner is ready to move." Cheryl said, "Honey, by Thursday everyone who matters in that city will know." She was right. Here is something about commercial real estate in a mid-sized American city that people outside the industry don't always understand. It's a small world. The developers, the property managers, the city planners, the financing people, the major tenants, they all know each other. They go to the same chamber events. They serve on the same nonprofit boards. They have the same lunch spots. When a building like the Montrose changes hands, people notice. When the new owner is serious and well capitalized and moving fast, people notice that too. Lawrence Osei was not unknown in Nashville. He was less known in Memphis. But after Cheryl made her calls and Paul made his calls, that started to change. 2 things happened in the 6 weeks after Lawrence's visit to Cutter, Holt and Briggs. First, the Montrose building landed on the radar of a regional development consortium called Midtown Partners Group. They were in the middle of planning a mixed-use corridor that was going to stretch across 3 blocks of downtown Memphis, and they needed anchor commercial tenants for 2 of those blocks. The Montrose was a natural fit. Their lead consultant reached out to Paul Ifini's office. Paul scheduled a call. The call went well. Second, a woman named Jacqueline Fontenot, who sat on the board of the Memphis Commercial Development Authority, mentioned Lawrence's name at a working lunch. Jacqueline Fontenot had been following the Montrose acquisition with interest, because the MCDA had been hoping to see that building activated for years. When she heard the new owner had been getting the runaround from a local property management firm, she made a note of it. Jacqueline Fontenot was not a woman who made notes and then forgot about them. None of this was visible to Randolph Cutter. He was focused on other things. He was finalizing a lease renewal for one of his longtime clients. He was having his office repainted. He was attending a dinner for a civic organization he'd been part of for 15 years. He was not thinking about Lawrence Osei. He was not thinking about the Montrose building. He had already decided that situation wasn't worth his time, and he'd moved on. That was his first mistake. The deciding. Because when you decide someone isn't worth your time before you know who they are, you stop paying attention. And when you stop paying attention, you stop seeing what's coming. 6 weeks after Lawrence's visit, Cutter, Holt and Briggs received a letter. It came on the letterhead of the Memphis Commercial Development Authority. It was addressed to Randolph personally. It informed him that the MCDA was undertaking a review of property management firms operating in the downtown development zone, and that as part of this review, the MCDA would be assessing each firm's current client relationships, tenant placement track record, and community investment profile. It also noted that the MCDA had recently begun working with the owner of the Montrose building on the Midtown Partners Corridor project, and that this project was expected to be one of the most significant commercial developments in downtown Memphis in the past 15 years. The letter was signed by Jacqueline Fontenot, board chair. Randolph Cutter read it twice. Then he called Thomas Alcott into his office. "That property on Monroe," he said. "The Montrose. What's the status of that?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Sir," he said carefully, "we didn't move forward with that one. The gentleman, Mr. Osei, he reached out a few times, but you indicated—" "I know what I indicated," Randolph said. "Get him on the phone." Thomas got Lawrence's number. Randolph called himself. Lawrence picked up on the 3rd ring. Randolph introduced himself properly this time. No son, no skepticism in his voice. He said he'd been reviewing some incoming partnerships, and he wanted to revisit the conversation about the Montrose. He said he thought there might be a good fit after all. Lawrence said, "I appreciate the call, Mr. Cutter. I'm actually in a meeting with the Midtown Partners team this week. Let me get back to you when things settle." He never got back to him. This is the part of the story where some people might say, why didn't Lawrence just come in and set the record straight from the beginning? Why didn't he show up with his financials and his portfolio and make them see who he was? And the answer is, he did. He showed up. He had the deed. He had the documentation. He had 12 years of work behind him. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that Randolph Cutter looked at Lawrence and saw someone whose time wasn't worth his respect. And no amount of paper changes that kind of decision once a man has made it in his gut. You can show some people your credentials, and they'll find a reason to doubt them. You can show them your track record, and they'll wonder who you knew. You can sit in their conference room with everything laid out, and they'll still be thinking about whether you belong there. Lawrence knew this. He'd known it since he was 23 years old, and a bank manager had suggested, very gently, that maybe he should think about a partner on his first loan application. Someone with more established credit history, he'd said, with a particular kind of pause in his voice. Lawrence had gone to a different bank, got the loan, paid it off in full 4 years early. He didn't fight the wall, he walked around it. And then he kept walking until the wall was far behind him. The Midtown Partners Corridor announcement came in the spring. It was covered in the Memphis Business Journal. It was covered in the Commercial Appeal. A regional real estate trade publication did a longer piece on the development and included a profile on several of the principals involved. Lawrence Osei was named as the owner of the Montrose building and described as one of the anchor property holders in the eastern section of the corridor. The piece mentioned his portfolio. It mentioned the properties he'd developed in Nashville and Atlanta. It mentioned the financing structure for the Montrose renovation, which he had put together without institutional backing, private capital, his own reserves, a structure that several people quoted in the article called unusually sophisticated for an independent operator. There was a photograph. Lawrence in front of the Montrose in that same gray herringbone blazer. He looked exactly like himself. Randolph Cutter's name appeared in the same article, in a different context. Cutter, Holt & Briggs was mentioned briefly in a sidebar about local property management firms and the MCDA review process. The sidebar noted that several firms had been flagged for inconsistent engagement with emerging property owners in the development zone. It did not name Randolph specifically. It didn't need to. The MCDA review concluded 4 months later. 2 firms received formal letters of commendation for their community engagement. 3 firms were designated as preferred partners for the corridor project, meaning they'd have first access to new tenant referrals within the zone. Cutter, Holt & Briggs was not among them. Randolph received a letter informing him that the firm had not met the engagement threshold for preferred partner status and that the firm would not be included in the initial referral network for the Midtown Corridor. He called his attorney. His attorney told him there wasn't much to do. The review was based on documented outreach patterns and tenant relationship history. The MCDA had the authority to set its own partnership criteria. This wasn't a legal matter. This was a market matter. What Randolph did not know, because he had not done the research he should have done 8 months earlier, was that the Midtown Corridor project was going to generate somewhere in the range of 60 to 90 new commercial tenant placements over the next 5 years. Placement fees, management contracts, lease commissions. For a firm the size of Cutter, Holt & Briggs, being inside that referral network versus outside, it was not a minor thing. It was the difference between a decade of significant growth and a decade of standing still. He had shut himself out of it, with one sentence in a lobby, on a Tuesday morning, son. Thomas Alcott left the firm 7 months later. He joined a smaller boutique real estate consultancy that had, notably, just signed a consulting agreement with Lakeview Meridian LLC. When Randolph found out, he called Thomas into his office first. Thomas was 29 by then, He had thought about what he wanted to say if this moment ever came. He said, "With respect, sir, I think I've learned everything I can here." It was a polite thing to say. Both of them knew it was also an honest one. About a year after all of this, Jacqueline Fontenot was speaking on a panel at a commercial real estate conference in Nashville. The topic was equitable development and closing the wealth gap through property ownership. She told a version of this story. She didn't use names. As an example of what she called invisible friction. She said, "Invisible friction is what happens when the people who control access to opportunity make decisions about who deserves a seat at the table before they've looked at a single number. It's not always fire and fury. Sometimes it's just a man who calls another man's son and thinks he's done with him, and then watches that man build something he'll never be invited into." The room was quiet for a moment after she said that. Then someone started clapping, and it spread quickly. The way things do, when a room full of people have all been waiting to hear something said plainly. Lawrence Osei finished the first phase of the Montrose renovation in the fall of that year. He opened the ground floor to 3 tenants, a coffee and co-working space, a boutique law office, and a regional branch of a credit union focused on small business lending. The upper floors were in the middle of being converted to professional office suites, with the atrium on the second floor restored and rented out for events. At the opening reception, Lawrence stood near the back of the atrium and watched people move through the space. The skylights had been cleaned. Late afternoon light came through them in long, even panels across the original tile floor. A woman came to stand next to him. She was maybe 65, elegantly dressed, and she looked at the room the way people look at things they've been hoping to see for a long time. She said, "You know, I used to pass this building every week and think, someone should do something with it." Lawrence said, "Took a while to get here." She nodded. Most good things do. He didn't tell her about Randolph Cutter. He didn't talk about the 35-minute meeting in the room by the copy machines. He didn't mention the 22 minutes he spent waiting in a lobby, while a man with his father's name on the wall decided he wasn't worth the good conference room. He didn't need to. The building said it for him. Randolph Cutter still runs Cutter, Holt & Briggs. The firm is still operating. It's not collapsed, not disgraced, not gone. That's not how this kind of story ends, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But here is what's true. The Midtown Corridor is now in its 3rd year of development. 41 new commercial tenants have been placed in the zone so far. The 3 preferred partner firms from the MCDA's initial review have handled the majority of those placements. The combined commissions from those deals have been, by conservative industry estimate, substantial. Cutter, Holt & Briggs has handled 0 of them. Randolph has applied for preferred partner status again through the MCDA's annual review process. The first application was declined. The second is pending. Thomas Alcott, meanwhile, was promoted to senior associate at his new firm. He recently closed a lease deal for 2 floors of the Montrose building. He called Lawrence afterward to thank him for the referral. Lawrence said, "You did good work. Keep doing it." There's a version of this story where Lawrence Osei storms into that lobby and demands to be treated with respect, and it becomes a scene where he raises his voice or threatens to walk or makes sure everyone in the room knows exactly how wrong Randolph Cutter is. That version is satisfying to imagine. It would make a different kind of video. But that's not what Lawrence did. And the reason it's not what he did isn't because he was passive or afraid or didn't have the words. It's because he'd learned something that took him years to learn. That the most powerful thing a man can do when someone has written him off is to keep moving. Quietly, steadily, with purpose. Let other people announce themselves. Let them demand recognition. Let them fill rooms with their own noise. You build the room. If you've ever been in a lobby and had someone look through you, not at you, through you, then you know what Lawrence felt in those 22 minutes he waited. You know the particular effort it takes to hold yourself still, when everything in you wants to either fight or leave. You also know the particular satisfaction of watching a building you weren't supposed to own become exactly what you always knew it could be. If this story hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're sitting on something, A plan, a building, an idea, a version of yourself that other people haven't figured out yet. Just keep building. Don't wait for the conference room. The room comes later. We'll see you in the next one.